Bill White, who you've now all seen, who's a fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute in Canada and the former chairman of Economic and Development Review Committee at the OECD. And he will give a keynote now about the evolution of monetary policy in the age of uncertainty, of which, of course, climate change, or I suspect, is a very big part of this uncertainty. And there will be opportunities to ask him questions at the end of the presentation. So yeah, the floor is yours, Bill.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me thank the Central Bank of Armenia and, of course, Doug and the Better Policy Project for having invited me here today. The topic is written down as the evolution of monetary policy in an age of uncertainty, but it could just as easily have been titled, "What can monetary policy do to avoid the dark corners?" So I really want to make two major points here. I want to start off by trying to convince you that monetary policy has in fact been conducted quite badly in the past. I think it contributed materially to the great financial crisis. And I think, as Doug has just suggested a few moments ago, I was listening to the panel, that it is entirely possible that we have got GFC 2.0 coming down the road. And that too, I think, has been, I think monetary policy has made a significant contribution to that. So that's the first point that I want to make, that things have been done badly. And the second point I want to make, I think, is that I think this approach of prudent risk management is a significant step forward in helping us deal with these kinds of problems going forward. So those are really the two principal points that I want to make. And not only do I think that it has been a positive contribution to this project has been a contribution to future monetary policy being conducted better, but I think it's also made a very useful contribution to how models and modeling can be better incorporated into the monetary policy framework. So let me talk about those two things. But it's been done badly and it can be done better. Let me just tell you why I think this is crucially important. I do not hold, and I think you, from what I've heard, do not hold with the view of the standard models that the economy is linear, deterministic, understandable, self-equilibrating. I don't believe that stuff. I think that monetary economies are complex adaptive systems, like systems in nature and in society, that have been well studied by other disciplines. And that these systems have got breakdowns, multiple equilibria, they've got tipping points or dark corners that we want to avoid. I also want to make the point, and again, I know this conflicts with standard theory, and I'm glad to say Doug, I think, has said he also sort of agrees with me on this, that the breakdowns affect nominal prices, but they've also got real and long-lasting real effects as well. And I just ask you to think about the implications of the great financial crisis. I ask you to think back again about the Great Depression. These economic crises, which in complex systems are determined by power laws, so that little crises occur quite frequently, but big crises occur very infrequently. These crises are often not confined to just having economic consequences only. The economic system, as I see it, is one system nested in a bunch of other systems that are also complex and adaptive. So I'm thinking in terms of the political system and the environmental system, which are two very, very pertinent things today. I think that our democratic systems in the West are already stumbling in many ways. The move to populism could well have unfortunate effects, could have desirable effects, but I worry more about the downside. I think if we do wind up having a kind of threats to our democratic system They're also likely to be threats to the environmental system. That if you wind up having significant economic and political problems, environmental problems are likely to go further down the ladder of the things that we're concerned about. And that, I think, actually is an existential problem. So I repeat again, getting monetary policy right is crucially important because if you don't get it right, you can have implications not only for the economic system, but really far beyond. Let me start off with some what I call some facts, just about going back to what's happened over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. I think monetary policy has succeeded in creating ever bigger bubbles. And one of the major, and this is a kind of overview of what I'm going to say here in a moment. I think we've had a kind of oversimplification of the way in which the economy works. I say here, first bullet, three major structural developments since the 1980s. And those three structural developments, first of all, globalization and the demographics that basically pushed inflation down for over 30 years. The second one was financial deregulation and vastly expanded sources of credit. At the moment, I think the non-banks actually provide more than 50% of all the credit being provided. They're bigger than the banks now. The third point, I guess, is that central banks became targeted, ever more sort of focused on low positive inflation. Those three developments in themselves were all good, but the problem is that the central banks, in deciding to focus more on price stability, really ignored two of them. And I mean, if you think back about your modeling work, it's been almost entirely on the demand side. And the questions of the financial system and questions of the supply side of the economy, I think have really had far too little attention paid to them. The upshot of that is that we've had a whole series of financial crises. I mean, if you think back to it, we had a financial crisis in 1990, another one in 2000, a lot of little ones in between. I'll get into the detail in a moment. 2007, and it wasn't rising inflation that caused the problem. Okay, it was problems emanating out of the financial system, and with monetary policy forced to becoming extremely and increasingly experimental. And let me just sort of briefly run through that whole sort of period. I think this sort of bad path that we're on actually started as far back as the Louvre Accord. That was in 1987, when basically all the world basically agreed at the Louvre Agreement to basically prop up the US dollar. And what that meant was sort of easy monetary conditions basically around the world. And I would contend, without going into any detail at the moment, that very plausibly led to the Japanese, the Scandinavian, and the other bubbles, including the S&Ls, that really culminated in the 1990s. And then as you went through the 1990s, there were a whole host of crises. We had and I remember all of these because I started work in this general area really back in the 1970s. In the 1990s, we had the Mexico crisis and the Mexico crisis, the peso crisis in 1994, the Asian crises in 1997, the failure of LTCM in 1998, and then we had the stock market crash. Remember the TMT bubble in 2000. And in each case, monetary policy was eased, and eventually, in the last case, down to, excuse me, really record low levels. And that was followed by what I call here the false promise of an enduring great moderation, that the interest rates went down very, very low, It did, in fact, stimulate a significant recovery. And we had a recovery where the inflation continued to be low, so much so that it got this, I can't remember who dreamed this up, but began to call it the Great Moderation. And the essential message was that somehow we've solved the problems and everything is going to be great going forward. Unfortunately, what everybody missed during that time period was the fact that credit growth and debt creation were sort of growing like gangbusters. And as was referred to in the earlier panel, there was huge amounts of innovation in the financial sector that meant that a lot of what was going on, the dangerous stuff that was going on really behind the scenes. Well, then we had the onset of the great financial crisis. And that, I guess one of the first points that I'd make is that it was totally unexpected. The IMF, and Doug, I don't want to give you a rough time here, but the spring wheel in March, I think, of 2008 predicted for the advanced market economies growth of something like 3.5% in 2009, and it came in at something like minus 3.6. And the IMF was not alone. I mean, all the central banks missed it. The OECD missed it. It was big and it was totally unexpected. And of course, the central banks reacted in an even more vigorous way than they had in 2001. Sort of hard to imagine, but they did it. We had rates came down to zero, and in some cases in Europe, of course, even below zero. We had forward guidance, we had QE, yield curve control. So the response was really vigorous. And then, of course, we had more of the same during the COVID crisis. And that was complemented as well by very rapid fiscal expansion. Well, the upshot of that, and I know there's still some questioning about who was exactly responsible for what, but it was certainly followed by rising inflation and by tighter monetary policy. Indeed, the degree of tightening after the long lag before the central banks decided to do anything, the degree of tightening and the extent to which it occurred over many countries, I think it's fair to say was unprecedented. And so today we find ourselves in a situation where inflation has gone down significantly, but in most of the big countries is still sort of above where the central banks want it to be. And I think there's growing concerns about whether it will go down further. And this, of course, is raising fears about both financial stability and fiscal sustainability, because we've got now private debt levels as a proportion of GDP or of sectoral income and public debt levels relative to GDP that are so high that there are growing fears, it seems to me, as was expressed in the last panel, about both financial stability, reflecting private sector credit, and about fiscal sustainability, reflecting excessive public sector deficit. And again, going back to my theme about complex systems and multiple equilibria, if you think about the fears about financial stability, the private side, you're really talking about fears of deflation. And of course, if you're talking about problems of fiscal sustainability and fiscal dominance, what you're really talking about is the possibility of very high inflation as opposed to deflation. So potential as it stands of a multi-equilibrium world. So much for the facts. The next question, I guess, if that's the what, what happened? The next question is why? And I would contend that the central banks had made four basic errors and I'll treat them one by one, and then talk about how prudent risk management is in part a kind of antidote to this way of thinking. Um, the 4 points, I think central banks overestimated the need for easy money. I think they overestimated the effectiveness of easy money. And at the same time, I think they underestimated the unintended consequences of easy money. And finally, they underestimated the difficulties of exit from easy money. And let me go to the first of these then. The central banks overestimated the need for easy money. When I was talking earlier on about globalization and all of these demographics and all of these positive supply side shocks, they ought not to have been a concern. Otherwise, put the disinflation associated with positive supply side shocks is very different from a disinflation associated with negative demand shocks. There was, in fact, a whole literature pre-war, well summarized in a book called Less Than Zero by George Selgin, that talks about this whole question about the need, about supply side shocks and how you should respond to them. And I think what's happened here is that by responding in the way we did, seeing a need for easy money, we put ourselves on a debt accumulation path, which is now really a major, major problem going forward, those levels of debt. We're caught in a debt trap of our own making. And if you think that that's just Bill White sort of talking about stuff that irks him, there's a very interesting comment in Paul Volcker's autobiography, where it seems to me that he totally agrees with this as a premise. And the quotation is, ironically, the easy money striving for a little inflation as a means of forestalling deflation could, in the end, be what brings it, the deflation, about. So I think I'm in good company that the need for easy money was overestimated. Sorry, I'm going backwards. The second point that I would make about the theory here, how false beliefs led to bad policy, is I think that central banks overestimated the effectiveness of easy money. And one sort of proof of that, and I've already made reference to the fact that all of the big guys basically missed the great financial crisis, never didn't see it coming, is that we had 10 years in a row almost after the crisis, when if you looked at the forecasts of the major central banks, the major IFIs, they always predicted year after year that inflation would be higher than subsequently happened. And they always forecasted growth would be stronger than what actually happened. And I think at the level of theory, that they underestimated and that they underestimated the effectiveness of monetary policy at any given moment in time. And I've written a lot about this, and so have many others. Um, I think just a plausible example. Why does consumption not respond to lower interest rates? Well, one answer is think about people saving for an annuity, to get a certain amount of money when they retire. If the interest rate goes down and the interest rate on their accumulated savings declines, then that part of the contribution to the annuity has gone down. And the only other way that you can compensate is actually by saving more. More broadly, and I think this is a wonderful quote from Keynes. Keynes saw this back in the general theory. And the quote was, if I remember correctly, if we are tempted to assert that money is the liquid that activate is the liquid that activates the system, we had best remember there are many slips twixt the cup and the lip, which of course is why Keynes then went on to recommend fiscal as opposed to monetary in those circumstances. But worse, I think, if you do this repeatedly, okay, these are the headwinds that Alan Greenspan used to talk about. If you do this repeatedly, then the debt accumulation becomes such that the debt itself is a negative, a feedback effect, preventing the lower interest rates from having the kind of response that you would like. And so the last bubble in this thing here is successive bubbles and the inexorable rise of debt ratios. Because the only way that you can think of getting out of the problem that you're in is to kick the can down the road just one more time. So this is a problem of long-standing. Third, about how false beliefs led to bad policy, I think it's been the underestimation of the unintended consequences, in addition, as it were, to the accumulating debt problem. I will be very brief, although I and many others have written about many aspects of this. The negative effects on inequality and democracy. Low interest rates push up asset prices, and most of the assets are held by rich people, which makes, of course, other people unhappy. Inequality leading to populism, threatening democracy. The negative effects on financial stability and fiscal stability. This has already been referred to. Financial institutions have their margins squeezed. The only way to get out of that, or at least a good chunk of what they do to get out of it, is to take on more risk and more leverage. The fiscal sustainability, there, as it were, if governments are confronted with the opportunity to borrow for nothing, you may rest assured that they will take advantage of the opportunity. And that is indeed exactly what they have done. The negative effects on central bank independence. If you have a situation where central banks are now threatened with fiscal dominance, the reality is they have already given up that independence. That's just arithmetic. It's no longer a question of motivation or will or capacity to lean against the inflation. They've lost the capacity to do so, and fiscal dominance has taken over. The negative effects on potential growth, whole literature, albeit much of it pre-war, on malinvestments, resource misallocations, the way that sits on potential growth going forward. Low interest rates facilitated the capacity of banks to bail out zombie firms that should have been made bankrupt years ago. All of that, again, leaning against faster potential growth going forward. The negative effects on emerging markets. If there's no rates of return to be had in the advanced markets, then you go for risk in the emerging market economies. And as we well know, and UNCTAD has been complaining about this for years, as the capital flows into the emerging markets, it creates problems, it recreates the bubbles there that we've seen in the advanced economies. And then, of course, when the money flows back out again, it creates even more havoc on the way out that it created on the way in. And lastly, and I think there were some references to this at the end of the last panel, the shortcomings of ample reserve operating systems. The operating systems always used to be based on scarce reserves, and they worked. But as soon as you flood the whole system with liquidity, the system doesn't work anymore. And you have to find a different way of controlling short-term interest rates. And I think what we have seen to date, and again, there's a burgeoning literature in all of this stuff, is that the system that's replaced it is really far more prone to overshoots and serious liquidity problems than we had previously. So, and then of course the last last one is the difficulties of exit from easy money policies. My first bullet here about political economy arguments for hesitating to raise rates. The simple thing is that raising rates is a lot less politically palatable than lowering rates. So from a political economy perspective, there's always this bias to have easy money. And today, I think the problem that we've got on the basis of all of the stuff that I've already talked about is that central banks and others are becoming increasingly concerned that if they do raise the rates or keep higher rates for longer, that this will create problems either in the financial system or in the fiscal domain that could lead to accusations of the central banks actually causing these problems, which I would contend in some longer run sense they have, but in some shorter run sense they haven't. But in any event, it's going to be a constraint on them doing what I think would be the desirable thing to do. And the negative supply shocks coming down the road will make future trade-offs worse. And there was reference made to this in the last panel and the question right at the end about climate change. All of the positive supply side shocks that we saw over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, they're all going into reverse. And again, I've written on this, but I'd say very briefly, globalization with all its benefits is turning to deglobalization. Good demographics are turning to bad demographics. The search for efficiency is replaced by the search for resilience. The reliance on ample fossil fuels is now turning into a shortage of green fuels, given the carbon budget and all that stuff. And favorable, what I call guns and butter, is now turning into unfavorable guns and butter. And what I mean by that was we had many years of reaping the dividend from the end of the Cold War. Now that's all going into reverse. I don't have to say anything more to this audience and your particular geographical region. And the butter thing is much the same, that the inequalities are now crying out for more of a fiscal response. The population is now so much older, the extreme health costs of dealing with older people. So the guns and the butter's going in the wrong place as well. And exiting from quantitative easing faces special difficulties. And this goes back to what I was talking about before, about the different operating systems. There was a recent paper by Asharia and Rajan that made the point that the banks were given all of these extra reserves, but because they're profit-making institutions, they found ways of putting those reserves to use. Okay, so they created a demand for those excess reserves. And now we have a situation where we don't know where the demand for reserves is. So if you take them away, you're never quite sure what the implications will be. So that's another problem that I think we have to deal with. It's not as if people haven't been listening, watching, and formulating their own sort of views about ways in which perhaps things might be improved. And I think, as my first bullet here shows, that I think perhaps the catalyst for some of that rethinking was the growing recognition that the last Fed review in 2022 was really a bit of a disaster because it was based on the idea of average inflation targeting. It really meant that inflation was less of a threat than deflation, and that you could let inflation run hot for a while and it wouldn't be a problem. And of course, we now realize that it was a problem. So that was the first thing that we looking backwards on the last Fed review, there's some serious grounds for rethinking. There have been quite a number of these reviews of various sorts, and I list them down below on this slide. But one of the suggestions that seems to me to be absolutely sort of central to all of them is the recognition of how much stuff has happened that's been unexpected, how many things have turned out to have side effects that we didn't anticipate. So virtually all of these suggestions stress the need for more humility and more prudence in the conduct of monetary policy, which I guess at first sight seems to me to absolutely go along with the idea of prudent risk management. But I'll say more about that in a second. Most of these suggestions as well pay more attention to supply side developments. I think since the crisis in particular, there's been the COVID crisis. I think there's been a growing recognition that supply side developments can be really important, and we need to pay more attention to them than we have. Well, turning to the individual reports, and I'm going to be very, very brief here. Um, the G30 did a big report, I think about a year ago, and it was called Central Banking and Monetary Policy Principles and the Way Forward. And the BI, that was in 2023, and then the BIS annual report in 2024. And I think the two of them, if you had to look at just sort of one sort of phrase to describe it, it was that they stressed the dangers of prolonged easy money, with the emphasis on the prolonged. The whole idea that prolonged policies of this sort can lead to a cumulative buildup of debt and other problems that could prove hard to rectify. Then we had the Geneva report that came out really just late in 2024. That one was called Much Money, Little Capital, and Few Reforms. And I guess the point that I would make here, and this is a quote from the report, the most urgent reforms are integrating financial stability considerations more into monetary policy and operations. Then we have the Bernanke report, and there were all sorts of them that were sort of ably summarized in a previous report, actually, from the CBA and the Better Policy Project. I tended to feel, and I think most commentators tended to feel, that there was less here than met the eye. But having said that, Bernanke did make a very clear statement for having more clarity about the transmission mechanism and how it all worked. And I think that was really useful. And I put here, he also recommends need for alternative scenarios. He did so in the context of maintaining the base case. Okay, talking about alternative scenarios around the base case. And then there were sort of individual pieces, speeches and things. I'm thinking particularly about two stellar performers, Isabel Schnabel, who's more recently on the scene, and Charles Goodhart, who was my first boss at the Bank of England, who's been on the scene forever. And both of them came down very strongly in terms of the need for alternative scenarios. And I guess that the point that I will make now, as I turn to these final slides to sum up, is that I think the prudential risk management approach responds to these suggestions. And the first point that I make here is they come out very strongly in terms of the reliance on alternative scenarios as a response to uncertainty. I think that the minimizing loss functions in the latest version of the models, EndoCred, or otherwise put avoiding dark corners, is also very important. Nonlinearities. I started on about that right at the beginning about complex adaptive systems and avoiding nonlinearities or tipping points. They've built into the latest versions of the model ways to explicitly create nonlinearities in the model. And I think the two most important ones are obviously the nonlinear Phillips curve And also, and arguably even more important, the idea that credibility is based not on what you say, but on what you do. And so that actual inflation feeds into credibility, that feeds into expectations, which can lead to an important feedback effect. So nonlinearities, which also imply that inflation is more costly than deflation, I think is a good thing. I think the supply shocks, as I understand the prudent risk management, there's more attention likely to be paid to that. And lastly, this whole question, because I think the finance thing is still underestimated in our models and the way we do things. But I do think it's an important step forward that the models have got more clarity about the transmission mechanism and explicitly assume that money creation is an endogenous process. That is to say that money is created when banks write up both sides of their balance sheet. And as soon as you admit that, and I believe it's a fact, that's the way the system works. Um, as soon as you accept that, you're halfway to getting to a world in which you can have bubbles, financial bubbles, booms and busts, and you can start thinking in some serious way about what you might do in a model kind world to simulate these sorts of problems. I would also contend that this prudential risk management approach, in important ways, reacts against the false beliefs that I said earlier were, I think, behind the motivation of central banks in doing what they did. First of all, this question of the need for easy money. The way in which the prudential risk management and the nonlinearities emphasizes inflation dangers and also the fact that it recognizes negative supply shocks will be a very important step going forward. The effectiveness of easy money, which I think was overestimated by the central banks. And I think assuming endogenous credibility is a very important negative feedback effect. I think via the financial variables that other things could be introduced to deal with this problem. But I think the credibility effect is a very important step forward. The unintended consequences of easy money. I think the greater attention paid to distributional issues, the better. And also the effects on financial variables. As I said earlier on, with endogenous money, you're starting to get into that range of territory is very helpful. And the difficulties of exit. Again, I heard earlier on the concerns raised about financial dominance and fiscal dominance. And I think recognizing that as something that contributes to the difficulties of exit is very important. And this is my last slide. Having said that, I think we've had problems building up, and that this way of looking at the world is a desirable step forward in trying to minimize some of these dangers. Is that when we do have credible models, and that's sort of what we're working towards, there are still a lot of important questions out there, some of which were raised in the panel just a few minutes ago, but I think that they all deserve to be looked at. Is it better to lean against a bubble or just clean up after? The thing about credible models is that you can use simulations to help you come to a conclusion without costly social experiments, without actually having to try to do it. So I think that's a very important question. Should monetary leaning be complemented with other policies? This came up in the previous panel, for example, macroprudential policies. When I was first at the BIS in the 1990s, and we first started talking about all of this stuff about macroprudential, because that's where it began, was at the BIS. We always thought about macroprudential and monetary policy as complementary measures to lean against the to lean against credit bubbles. Whereas in recent years, they've been used as we'll use macroprudential to avoid the worst effects of lower for longer, which I think is the very opposite of what the sort of creators of this whole thing had originally intended. Do asymmetric responses to inflation and deflation matter? What are the implications of different expectations formations? I think the way in which prudential risk management models are being operated, where you can switch from maybe targets really are important to a world in which maybe they're not. Maybe the only thing that influences future inflationary expectations is past inflationary developments. Important to be able to look at how important those things is. Should normal interest rates be constrained well above zero? Both, I think the G30 report and the BIS report basically say there should be limits on how far the real rate should be allowed to go. Just bang, just limits. Well, we should use model simulations to try and check and see whether in fact that's true or not. And can changes to incentives and structure improve outcomes? There was a reference in the panel to narrow money. Now, that would be a major structural change indeed. We know that in most other complex systems, people do recognize the fact that you can change the system using modularity, using feedback mechanisms. You can change incentives and structure to improve outcomes. Well, it would be good to sort of test all of that stuff out in a model setting. So to finish, I guess I see this prudential risk management framework as a significant step forward. I think there's still more work to be done, particularly with respect to the incorporation of financial and debt credit type variables. But I think it is a step forward, and I think I would offer my congratulations to all of the people that have been involved in it. So thank you very much.